Okay, good morning. Sasha, please take the roll.
Commissioner Adaro,
Here.
Commissioner Cardenas. Here. Commissioner Hatch,
Here.
Commissioner Hayward.
Here.
Chair Remke.
Here. Okay, welcome. We have a full agenda. As noted on the agenda, depending on how things are moving, it's anticipated we will take a lunch break today for an hour, approximately 12:30, depending on where we are in the schedule. So we'll just try to be flexible to get through things. Any public comment for an item not on the agenda today? All right, hearing or seeing none, we'll go right into the matters. Item 2 is the approval of commission minutes from February 2018. Any questions or comments from the commissioners?
I have.
Commissioner Odero.
So I think there are 3 typos that have to be corrected. On page 81, at the top, where it shows an exchange between Ms. West and myself, that was between the chair and myself. So I think that has to be changed. Then on page 92, the last paragraph where Ms. West is speaking, the first sentence, it says, "So that is a check imbalance that was put in place." That's supposed to be a check and balance. And then on page 117, there's a phonetic spelling of Dan Schnur that probably should be corrected. So his name is Dan, and then his last name is Schnur. And that's it.
Any other questions or comments from the commissioners? Is there a motion?
I move adoption of the minutes with those corrections.
Second.
Commissioner Adaro,
Yes.
Commissioner Cardenas. Yes. Commissioner Hatch,
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward.
Yes.
Chair Remke.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, we'll move to the enforcement consent calendar. Ms. West? Did you have an item you needed to pull? Did I hear that?
I did, I just don't have a cord. Enforcement will be pulling items 7 and 8.
7 and 8. 7's the default, or one of the defaults?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, do the commissioners have any items they would like removed from the consent calendar?
I just have a question.
Commissioner Odero?
Can you tell us why you're pulling 7 and 8?
Sure. Number 7 was Mr. Navarro has said that he will come up to date with all of his filings on the 28th, and we are giving him one last chance, as we have also modified the default from the last time you saw it to reduce the charges, so we're working to resolve that matter. And number 8, you may recall, was a default, and we accepted a personal check on the day she appeared, which we haven't received full funds on.
That was a long time ago.
It was.
Okay, thank you.
So any items to be removed? Okay.
Yes. Excuse me.
Commissioner Hatch?
Item 5, Madam Chair.
Okay, any others? All right, as for those remaining on the consent calendar, any questions for Ms. West from the commissioners?
I move adoption.
Any public comment for the remaining items on consent? Okay, seeing or hearing none, there's a motion to approve the consent calendar, correct?
Yes.
So that would be 3 through 15 minus 5, 7, and 8. Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Darrow?
Yes.
Commissioner Cardenas? Yes. Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Remke?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Okay, item 5. Commissioner Hatch, you want to start?
Actually, I'm kind of mindful of the clock. We've got a full house of people who would like to, are here on other issues. I would ask your permission to take this item and delay it towards the end of the agenda so that we can move on with the agenda. I anticipate it's going to take a while to go through this, item 5.
I would just encourage you to go ahead and bring it up now. We have lots of things that are going to take a long time, so probably should finish up with the enforcement while we're on it.
Well, I think you're doing a disservice to some of the folks that have come here for other things. This is something that's probably only I care about, so please beg your,
Okay, we'll move it to the end of the calendar.
thank you.
Okay, starting with item 16, adoption of amendments to Regulation 18401.
Good morning, Chair Remke and Commissioners. Suki Brar, Senior Counsel, Legal Division. I'm here to present proposed amendments to Regulation 18401, required record keeping, which cover record keeping for earmarking and electronic mailings, as well as other minor amendments. This regulation was before the Commission at its January meeting as part of Phase 2 of the AB 249 regulations. At that time, the Commission decided to put this reg over in order to give staff more time to seek feedback from interested persons and provide more information on record-keeping requirements. Staff conducted an interested persons meeting on February 13th, the second interested persons meeting for this regulation, and sought input from California Clean Money Campaign as well as others from the regulated community. Those comments are reflected in the staff memo for this item. Staff recommends the Commission adopt the proposed amendments to Regulation 18401.
Thank you. Any questions from the commissioners?
I do.
Commissioner O'Darrow?
So we kind of went back and forth on the LIFO issue, and you did put in using a reasonable accounting method such as, but not limited to, last in, first out accounting method. And I think that that's helpful. But I want to make sure that there isn't going to be a practice of creating any kind of presumption for LIFO. So I would like to put some language in to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Okay.
So what I would suggest is, I should have printed it out, I'm sorry. I'll send it to you printed afterward, but I would suggest that the sentence that starts "this determination" be revised as follows. This determination must be done using a reasonable accounting method, such as but not limited to the last in, first out accounting method, where you have a comma. Then I would insert, but no accounting method will be given more credence over another, and no rebuttable presumption, well, let's take out presumption, and no presumption of any kind of compliance is hereby created by the use of LIFO, period. Notwithstanding anything else in this section, comma, then get rid of your however. Earmark funds must be, I'm not sure I would say counted, I would say disclosed, because that's what the issue is, right? So I would change counted to disclosed. Earmark funds must be disclosed first before non-earmarked funds. Does that make sense?
It does. I'd prefer to leave it counted just because that they're determining how to count the funds. That's why I put counted. Disclosed is more so like what you're going to be putting on your report or what you're putting on an ad. And this is sort of a little bit of both, of keeping records, counting it, and disclosing it all together. So.
But isn't the sentence in front of that, before that, talk about must retain documentation showing how a determination of which top contributors to disclose on its advertisement was made?
Right, so that disclosure happens after they've made the determination.
Right, so you're referencing a determination of who to disclose, and then you say, this determination, which I assume means the determination to disclose.
Correct.
So why do we then change it to count instead of disclose?
I was just saying that because that's talking about when the counting part is when they're trying to determine what to disclose.
Well, then I don't think we should be saying this determination. You're changing the determination, is all I'm saying. And that's fine. If you want to have a sentence in there about how to count, that's fine. Have a sentence about how to count. But I don't think this makes sense, the way that it's written. And I guess that's what we're here to do, is to kind of wordsmith it.
Well, could you read it again, because I don't understand what you're proposing?
Sure. This determination must be done using a reasonable accounting method, such as but not limited to the last in, first out accounting method, but no accounting method will be given more credence over another, and no presumption of any kind of compliance is hereby created by the use of LIFO. Notwithstanding anything else in this section, earmarked funds must be disclosed first before non-earmarked funds.
Suki, am I correct that all of these have to be disclosed?
Right.
This is an issue of who has to be on the...
Right, which one they're counting.
On the ad.
Yes.
And if you can manipulate how it's counted, then you can avoid earmarked funds from the funder being disclosed at all, or at least taken into consideration in determining whose name or what organization's name is going to be on the
Yes,
on the actual
yes,
ad,
that's correct.
right?
Yeah.
So is there like a third way you can do that, or do you think counted is? And I ask that because I'm not sure disclosed is the right word either, so.
Yeah,
So if I understand, Suki, so is the first sentence about this, that you have to disclose X. The second part is about the accounting method to figure out who you count to disclose X.
well, it's really talking about how you account for what you're disclosing.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
All right.
In other words, this is not about who gets disclosed. They all have to be disclosed. The question is, whose name is going to be required to appear on the ad, and how you count the money to get there.
Right. So I think counted works. I'm not sure, I can't think of another word right at this moment for it, but I don't think disclosed is the right term for that.
How do people feel about identified?
Suki, does that work for you? Identified?
I guess that could work too. Identified, I'm not sure if that would mean that they have to count that person or just identify them. So I'm open to suggestions though. If the commission likes identified, I'm fine with that.
Well, I'm fine with counted.
For my part, yeah, I understood counted as being something that's done internally to the organization before disclosure
Exactly, yes.
and sunlight and disinfectants and all that. Yeah. Anybody else?
But maybe releasing with the phrase, taken into account,
That works for me.
work for you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So,
Did you get the rest of it?
I got most of
I can
it,
read
but
it again if you
you're
want.
good. Okay.
Maybe a little bit slower?
I'm sure we'll have it on our minutes as well, so I can get it from there.
And I'll send it to you in writing.
Okay,
But
that works.
just in the interest of making everybody happy. Okay, so the sentence would say, this determination must be done using a reasonable accounting method, such as but not limited to the last in, first out accounting method. That's exactly what you had. Comma, here's what I'm inserting. But no accounting method will be given more credence over another, and no presumption of any kind regarding compliance is hereby created by the use of LIFO, period. Notwithstanding anything else in this section, comma, and then now we pick up your language, earmarked funds must be, and then we'll take out counted, and we'll put in taken into account first before non-earmarked funds. Does that?
Yeah, that works for me.
You got that? Okay.
I move as amended.
I have a
First,
question.
Yeah, other questions, and then we'll have to have public comment as well. Commissioner Hayward?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering about record keeping in this day and age. And it's not clear from the language of this reg, though it may be because I don't understand that there are other regs that comport on this, so, help me on this. Can a committee or a filer scan original documents and keep them in electronic form? Or do they have to keep the actual material piece of paper?
I'm not sure on that, actually. I think it depends on what the record is. It's like a bank statement could probably be kept in electronic form, but something that needs a signature may need, enforcement would probably know more
Okay,
about
because
that. Yeah.
I guess what I'm thinking, more and more, all of my stuff is done by scanning paper documents because the paper can be lost in the scan, once it's in Dropbox, lives forever. And you would want people to have a more secure, you'd want to encourage people to have a more secure routine rather than a less secure routine.
Right.
But I didn't know if we accepted scans as documents or as originals. And maybe we don't.
Sorry, Brian Lau, Assistant General Counsel. I think if you do go into the next paragraph where it talks about what the original source documentation requires, it does refer to copies. So to the extent that they have a copy, I can't imagine we would ask for.
Okay.
Unless there's a question about the authenticity
Well,
of the copy.
I wanted to air
obviously.
that question in case there was doubt or in case you had in your mind that no, in fact, you have to have that little worn receipt. You couldn't possibly scan it. That would be wrong.
Yeah, I think it just depends on the nature of the record.
Sure.
Yeah. If someone needs to be verified on paper, then maybe that would have to be.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have a written rule or policy on those kinds of things?
I think, like Brian noted, that it would be in our regulations, so we would follow what our regulations say. So if it says it allows for copies, then we would allow for copies. If it says it has to be an original with a signature and on paper, like a paper copy, there are sections of the Act that require paper copies of certain things,
But
then
those
we
are
would follow
explicit.
that. They are, as far as I know. Yeah.
All right.
Any other questions for commissioners? All right, public comment?
Hello, Trent Lang, President of the California Clean Money Campaign, the sponsor of AB 249. We'd like to thank staff for its excellent work on this regulation. We think the additions to track the new earmarking rules are very appropriate. The Commission's friendly amendments to clarify that seem fine by me. So we request that you approve this regulation. On just a related comment, I probably should have done this in general comment, but still on AB 249, since we're speaking of different language issues. As many of you are aware, Assemblymember Mullen has a bill, AB 2155, which is a cleanup. We're using as a cleanup bill for potentially for any issues that the Commission identifies with the code for AB 249. It's currently been referred to the Assembly Elections Committee on the April 11th hearing. We would be very eager to hear see any suggested cleanup improvements to AB 249 that you guys might have, and eagerly await them. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
Jack Blattner with California Common Cause. We'd just like to echo Trent and say we're fully in support of this regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public comment? Okay, seeing or hearing none, is there a motion?
I'll move to approve as amended.
Second.
Commissioner Adaro,
Yes.
Commissioner Cardenas, Commissioner Hatch,
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward,
Yes.
Chair Remke.
Yes.
The motion passes.
Thank you, Suki. All right, next up is adoption of amendments to Regulation 18450.1.
Good morning. Karen
morning.
Harrison, Commission Counsel. Good morning, Commissioners. Chair Remke. I'm here to present the proposed amendments to Regulation 18450.1. This is the regulation which interprets Section 84501, which provides the definition of advertisement for the purposes of determining when a campaign disclosure is required. This matter was brought before the Commission at the December hearing. At that time, options 1 and 2 were presented, and option 3, as we refer to it, was proposed right before the hearing. And at the December hearing, the Commission requested that we prepare what the option 3 would look like as a regulation, and we held an interested persons meeting regarding that version in January. The comments from the interested persons meeting are recorded in the memorandum that you received. At this time, we recommend options 1 and 2, and we request that the Commission deliberate between the two options and approve the proposed amendments to the regulation. I would note that just prior to the hearing today, we received another proposed option. This is referred to by Mr. Lang as option 4. This option appears to supersede the option 3 and is much closer to the options 1 and 2 that were previously presented. I know that 2 of the commissioners that are present today were not present at the December hearing, so there may be some need to go back over some issues we discussed at the December hearing, but I would just like to address briefly the option 4, if I may. But first, to summarize, option 2 and option 1 and option 2 conforms Regulation 18450.1 to AB 249. It also provides cleanup to the existing language in the regulations. And most importantly, it continues the bright line threshold quantities that have been in place for determining when particular types of communications rise to the level of a general or public communication, as the term for advertisement is defined under Section 84501. Campaign disclosure requirements are a burden on free speech and must meet the exacting scrutiny standard as discussed in the memorandum. For that reason, we promote options 1 and 2, and option 4 appears to also recognize the need for thresholds. One difference between options 1 and 2 and 4, there's several differences. One is that option 4 is requesting to alter the threshold from the 200 level that's been in place since 2002 to a level of 50, which is certainly within the Commission's discretion. And this would be for purposes of telephone, emails, direct mail, but not for print materials designed to be individually distributed. This type of communication would still require a case-by-case analysis, which, detailed in the memorandum, raises exacting scrutiny issues. But there's a simpler way to describe the problem with exempting that one type of material. So imagine that I am a major donor committee, and I type up a bullet point of why I'm supporting a particular campaign, and I print it out, and I hand it to an individual. Under the proposal 4, that may or may not be an advertisement at that moment. It would be a print material. And under that proposal, there's no thresholds that are being recommended. But under option 4, if that same information were printed out and folded up and put into direct mail, then it would be subject to the thresholds. If that same document were emailed under proposal 4, it would be subject to thresholds. So for consistency, print materials that are to be individually distributed should also include the thresholds. And I think Proposal 4, Option 4, recognizes the need for thresholds. And I think that perhaps the tension is the number, the quantity. And I would just like to comment, the $200, the 200 quantity threshold. It's a bright line rule that's been in place since 2002. The regulated community is familiar with it. At the time that it was proposed back in 2001, the commission was given the option of 200, 500, or 1,000, and they chose the lowest option. The understanding is that 200 level matched the mass mailing definition, which is defined as over 200 substantially similar pieces of mail. And so that 200 had that kind of consistency. It is within the commission's discretion to consider that quantity. But that consistency, both with the longstanding policy and another definition of when something hits a certain benchmark that it's requiring the particular requirements under the Act, should be considered. With that said, the other items raised in Option 4, I'm happy to discuss, and any other questions about Options 1, 2, and 3. And I understand that it's a little bit confusing. So when we talk about versions, it's version with Option 1 and 2, and then there's some mild variation between Option 1 and 2. Option 3, I think, probably is not something that needs to be discussed much now, and the focus would be on the Option 4.
Question?
Commissioner Hatch?
A couple of questions. One is about the strict scrutiny that's led you to having a threshold in the first place, correct?
Could I just correct you? It's exacting scrutiny, which
Exacting,
is
okay.
it's a different standard than strict scrutiny, which we're more familiar with. Strict scrutiny requires a narrow tailoring, and those are in cases where free speech is being limited. And in this case, the courts have said it's a burden on free speech when you have campaign disclosure, and so therefore it's this exacting scrutiny, which is described as moderate tailoring.
Okay.
And so, I'm sorry, your question?
Which leads you then to having a threshold at all?
The threshold served the purpose of meeting.
Of meeting that?
Yes.
So if we were to say, consider proposing one that says there's no free space there, no 200, it's you hand one out, you're subject, that would be not meeting that test. Is that what you're implying?
There's concerns that if there were litigation, that this would not meet that standard, because you need to show a substantial relationship. The application of the burden on free speech, you need to show a substantial relationship to the state interest. So you would have to be able to show that interest is related to the burden. And as you get to documents that are less public in nature, less general in nature, you lose that relationship. You lose that moderate tailoring. And yes, you will miss some documents. That's sort of the nature of moderate tailoring.
I see. And then the example of where we came from 200, that was the mass mailing definition that was used in a completely different context. That was legislators spending state funds to put what appears to be a campaign statement out to all their constituents. So they passed this 200 thing, that the mailing had to be 200 or less in order to be paid for by state funds, correct?
Brian, would you like to address mass mailing issues?
The 200 would apply to, yes, governmental mailings of that nature, but it also applies to the mass mailings by a candidate. When a candidate does a mass mailing, they're required to put their name on the
Right, but the genesis was the legislative
It applies in both circumstances. In the second,
free mailings, but state expense.
but it also applies to the candidate mailings as well.
But
As
where
they do.
its genesis, where it was born.
I'm not sure which one came first.
I am.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So, and the reason why I'm getting there is I'm not so sure that we have to stick with 200 in whichever context. And at some point, I'd like to hear from the sponsors what they think the appropriate thresholds on each of these categories should be. And thank you, Chair, for your indulgence.
Any additional questions?
I have a question.
Commissioner O'Darrow?
So the decision between 200, 500, and 1,000, did I understand you correctly, and I don't know if I did, that they chose, that the commission at that point selected 200 because it was the smallest number?
I don't have background as to why they selected 200 as opposed to 500 as opposed to 1,000.
Oh.
It's possible because the 200 was the smallest number, or it's possible that it was because it hit the mass mailing number. And I know that there's always discussion about consistency, and something like mass mailing that affects all committees, to have that 200 number in mind is an easy threshold.
Sure, thank you. And then another question, and maybe this is for you, or maybe this is for what I anticipate will be public comment, but is there a reason that this number can't be part of the cleanup AB 2155? And then it's taken out of our hands, it becomes legislated, and we're done here.
I believe the legislature could further define what it means by public or general communication.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just note that in doing some research in other contexts, often it's in the statute, it'll say public or general communication, and then in the regulation it will define that. Citizens United had a good example where there was a video, and they defined in the regulation that it was 50,000 viewers made it a public or general video. And so, those thresholds can be different in different settings. Of course, that was within a primary district, 50,000.
Additional questions?
Where does option 4 come from?
Option 4 was presented by Mr. Lang yesterday, just before close of business. Did you not receive it?
I don't appear to have it. It doesn't appear to be on the internet.
Is it, where did you post it?
It is posted as public comment on the internet, and it was in the packet this morning.
Did you just give him a copy? It's the back attachment to this. It's just back. Yeah.
Just on the notion of leaving this to the legislature, Karen, to resolve the quantity issue, what, if anything, would we still need to do to make this regulation work in the context of the changes in the law?
As I understand your question, I think you're asking, can we wait right now for the legislature to do something, or do we need to pass something today? And the answer would be that we need to pass something today. This is the last remaining regulation that needs to be updated for AB 249.
Well, I guess then maybe the follow-up question is, what's the path that answers our issues or concerns based on the change in the law, but leaves some of this open? What path would you recommend?
The path that I would recommend is to continue the practice that we've had in place. And if we're going to allow the legislature to address it, then they can address it. There doesn't seem to be a reason to move from the path that we've been on. The regulated community is familiar with that threshold, has been operating under the thresholds. Some tailoring that's been recommended as far as yard signs or campaign buttons, I think we can address those things today.
So one or two, it goes back to your point about one or two, or what you are recommending.
Correct.
And the difference between 1 and 2, they both have the 200, but number 2 lumps yard signs in with billboards and road signs.
Correct. And if you'd like me to speak a little bit more about yard signs, I'm happy to do so. That was originally how this regulation came before the commission back in October. There was a request from the regulated community that we further define what a yard sign is. And that was because large signs we dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And the commission thought we could give a little more clarity to the regulation by defining the size of a yard sign. So we proposed 6 square feet as the definition for a yard sign, and maintaining, as it had been, produced in quantities of more than 200 to make it fit under that definition of general or public. we had a request from Mr. Lang that, that we lump yard signs in with large signs, road signs, billboards, and have them require disclosure at 1. And the argument was that a yard sign, by its very nature, is public. And that is something that the commission can consider, and so that became option 2.
Additional questions?
Just an expression that I think we need, I think we should have something in place, even though it may be temporary, vis-a-vis what the legislature may or may not do. So I would like to continue to pursue this.
Okay, any other questions? Because we'll hear from public comment then.
Hello again, Commissioners. Trent Lang, President of the California Clean Money Campaign, sponsor of AB 249. We, of course, testified on this issue opposing the option 1 and option 2 back in December. We still have grave concerns that those do not match the intent of AB 249 and that it does not serve the public. The letter that I sent in late yesterday describes those in detail, but I'll kind of highlight some of our concerns with that. So first of all, we believe that essentially what this does with direct mailers, flyers that are handed out to the public, door hangers, direct mail, emails, texts, robocalls, all these things are covered. These are things that campaigns do, is it leaves at a bare minimum up to 200 people in the dark about who paid for an ad whatsoever. Now, for a statewide ballot measure, for a statewide campaign, 200 voters usually, most of the time, isn't going to make a difference. But there are many times when it does make a difference, because AB 249 does not just cover state races, it covers legislative races that sometimes are much closer, and it covers city and county elections. And we identified in their tables in the letter that I sent yesterday, 23 city ballot measures in 2016 alone in California that were decided by fewer than 200 votes. Fewer than 200 votes. And there are 26 elections that were ballot measures in which 200 voters represent 10% or more of the electorate. So when you're talking 200 voters in city and county campaigns, that's a lot. And even in legislative races, you had there were 4 top 2 primaries last year in assembly races that were decided by fewer than 200 votes who were in the top 2. And there was 1 general election race for assembly that was decided by only 145 votes. So that's why this is such an important policy. 200 may not seem like that much when you look at a statewide ballot measure, but in city races, county races, and even legislative races, it can make a big difference. It also leaves the danger of having sophisticated committees use micro-targeting to send out 200 pieces of direct mail targeted carefully, very different from another 200 pieces of direct mail sent to another 200 voters, very different from another piece of direct mail sent to another 200 voters. Many campaigns use that today that did not use that back in 2002. This is a relatively new development. It's a little bit more on social media. Fortunately, that does not have this 200 loophole, but direct mail does happen under these situations. It's also going to leave voters confused and in the dark because they will be expecting to see the AB 249 disclosures. And if they get a mailer, or if they get a flyer or a door hanger or any of those pieces of information without a disclosure on it, how are they to know that whether or not the mailer is in violation, or the flyer is in violation, or the door hanger is in violation, or the bumper sticker is in violation, or they just happen to be number 155, and so it didn't have to have the disclosure. So we would anticipate that if this happens and people use this loophole, there will be a number of complaints to the commission saying, where's the disclosure, when the committee may actually have been using this exemption. Also, it's going to help lead. You're talking about the idea of reducing burden on committees. We believe, and you'll have testimony from other members of the public and other people representing committees, that this having two separate disclosure requirements for these types of communications based off of the number of communications that they have, because under 200 or fewer, you don't have to have the disclosure. More than 200, you do have to have the disclosure. That is a burden on committees, especially when they will have to provide records to prove one way or the other that they only printed 200 or fewer. And frankly, there's virtually no way you're going to be able to enforce that in an age when people have committees have high-speed printers in their offices. We have a high-speed printer in our office. We can run off 10,000 flyers pretty quickly and easily, and there is no record whatsoever of how many flyers we printed off. So good actors, acting committers, will have the burden of proving how many they printed or didn't print, and may have difficulty actually doing that. Bad actors will be able to completely flout the rules and say, oh, we only printed out 155 of these, don't worry, unless you can go out and individually figure out that they actually printed more than 200 of these copies. So you have a huge enforcement burden here with you when you have these sorts of thresholds. You have confusion with voters. You have confusions with for good acting committees. And lastly, we really don't believe that the commission has the authority to allow committees to leave 200 voters in the dark this way. The AB 249 was rewritten. We read the section definition for advertisement. We looked at that very carefully. We purposely removed the inclusion of person from the requirement to address concerns that individuals might be caught up in disclosure rules. So that is not an issue in AB 249 where it was previously. And the exclusion that we give to the authority that we give to the commission is any other communication as determined by the regulations of the commission. I can tell you that as a sponsor, and I can assure you the author's office will be here to testify also, that the intent was to allow other kinds of communications, future things. If people were advertising on blimps and they thought that that was impracticable, or 3D advertisements happen, et cetera. That was the intent of the legislation, was to allow you to address those kind of communications.
Can I just ask you a question about that, Mr. Lang, though?
Yes,
because
please.
I am having a hard time following the evolution of this proposal, because I believe it was in January, similar to the argument you're making now, you said that we didn't have the authority to have any threshold.
We still do not believe that you have the...
Is that right, though?
Yes, and we still actually do not believe you have the authority to put a threshold, and we, for strict legal reasons, we would prefer option 3. However, we do recognize the need for bright line tests, especially with things like emails and letters. We don't want to sweep those up. So we would be willing to compromise with option 4, which at least does provide that bright line test for things that stakeholders were concerned about, while keeping these campaign materials, especially the flyers, the door hangers, the posters, the campaign buttons, the campaign bumper stickers, without any threshold at all, because they're campaign materials.
If I could.
I'm not done. Thank you.
Oh,
So
excuse
at one point, I'm concerned that you're saying we have no authority. It was addressed in AB 249. It's 0. 1 goes out. There's a disclosure. Then some issues have been raised about that and the concern about bringing people in that were not intended, including in the email process. And now you're saying, well, I guess you have authority for 50. I just wonder again if this isn't an issue that it is better left for the legislature, with us leaving it as we had it with the tweaks that were already in process. Because it just seems now we're all over the board. You don't have authority, you do have authority for this. I mean,
Well, I'm sorry, let me address it. So part of the reason that we believe you do have the authority to make a threshold like 50 or 200 on emails or direct mails is that there is a question of what is a general or public communication there.
but why would it only go to those? What about for the flyers?
Because a
What
campaign
about-
button and a campaign bumper sticker is clearly meant and designed to be a general or public communication. A door hanger is clearly meant to be a general or public communication. A poster is by its very nature public. I suppose somebody's going to put, what are they going to put up a campaign poster in their bedroom? I doubt it. It's not like Star Wars. The only thing that could potentially be questionable there would be flyers. You know, somebody prints a flyer and they just give it to somebody. We might be open to some sort of tweak on just the flyer part to say something like flyers that are handed out to the public or to households. Then if they're handed out to the public, then clearly they are meant to be a campaign material. But if somebody prints up some bullet points and they just give it to their friend and it's not a public person, then that might not be a general or public communication. So that may be a tweak we might be.
With door hangers, that's going to a household, not handed out to the public. I mean, I guess I just feel like we're starting to create all these issues that could have probably been resolved at the legislature, or we have resolved them starting in 2001, and the issue is what's wrong with them.
What's wrong with them is that the intent of this legislation, which amended it again to take off person, to address some of the concerns that people had in the 2002 timeframe, they were reasonable concerns that individuals who print up flyers and go out to a market and hand them out, they print up 100 flyers or 200 flyers or 300 flyers, and they're not a committee, that's a reasonable concern because they're not sophisticated, they don't know the rules, they're not a committee. So AB 249 purposely amended this definition to remove persons so that only committees would these communications would fall under the definition of advertisements. They'd have to have the disclosures because if you're a committee, you should have you need to know the rules, basically. So we did address it by changing it. Certainly the intent of the legislation when we completely rewrote the disclosure rules for ballot measures and independent expenditures for television ads, radio ads, print materials was one of the sections that AB 249 completely rewrote from current law. It was always understood that every single ballot measure, there was not a single legislator that I talked to that I thought had mentioned anything not thinking that it'd be under 200. There's nobody, everybody assumed that it was any committee that did ads versus ballot measures or independent expenditures would have to have the disclosures.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Thank you. On this issue of the 50, this, as I understand it from your late communication, was offered in the spirit of compromise. You still are in the position that the first impression should be disclosed with a disclaimer, correct? With certain categories, I'm sorry.
I would say that it's an open enough question on things like email communications and direct mails that you do need to have some way of defining what is a general or public communication, because it's not obvious that an email is a general public communication in the same way that it's obvious that a bumper sticker or campaign button or door hanger. Nobody uses door hangers for anything except for a campaign. I mean, I guess maybe for Walmart, but so yeah. So I think that it would be important to have some, we're very cognizant of staff's concern about having to deal with things on a case-by-case basis. I think that we would want to avoid that. If we did not, the 50 threshold, which is much more reasonable and less likely to cause problems in small races than 200, is one way of doing it. You could potentially have other definitions of defining what a general public communication would be for terms of an email that one could come up with, but that would take more time to work to come up with things like, are you sending it to a friend? Are you sending it, there are other tests that you could come up with, but they are more complicated than a simple threshold of 50, which I think it is pretty clear that any emails that are substantially similar that go out to more than 50 people are about a campaign are clearly campaign related and general and public communication. So that's why we would accept that and proposed and offered it.
And the base that we have now, our existing rules, were envisioned at a time when everything was sent to the printer and, is quite clear. And now so many innovations have occurred since that allow very sophisticated kinds of communications targeted to individuals based on their social preferences or
Yes.
even their religion, I've seen used as a screener, so that there's no target too small for them to use.
Exactly.
And this is all to avoid any disclosure at all. And it's not an election that goes by that I don't receive something that has no disclaimer on it at all.
Right.
And I know people of goodwill who want to do the right thing can get caught in a trap where we're in the accounting game. We have been, and now we're just arguing about the threshold that we apply, but it's still an accounting game. And I've come to believe that everything that we adopt into form of regulation here to interpret a law that the legislature has provided us, we need to do it in a way that is auditable and it can be complied with. If it's not, and this is in one of those categories where this just doesn't work. I understand and I sympathize with the remarks made by staff about, this, what was that term? What kind of scrutiny? Exact scrutiny, thank you. But there is a balance here that we just needlessly going to scoop people up because things are so diffuse. As you say, I could email something out to a bunch of my friends, and they might decide to print them out and tailor them and send them to their friends, and quickly they're obviously over any kind of a threshold, and yet there's no disclaimer. And so the public would be far better served to just put the darn disclaimer on there from the first impression. And
Can I call your attention to the regulation where it talks about forwarded emails and telephone calls? If you have an email that's in substantially similar form and it's forwarded or has the intent to be forwarded to more than 200 recipients, then it falls under that category. So you can't just
no,
skirt
I get
the
that.
regulation.
I get that. But and then they send out 199 of their other friends and so on and so forth. But the point is that we don't have a clock on this. We don't have a mileage meter on it that tells me, with any certainty how many of these were sent out to people. And that's the problem, is how do you comply, or how do you enforce the compliance when you've got no ability to determine whether there has been or has not been compliance? If we have a law like that, or I should say a regulation like that, we need to rethink it. And I think I'd rather risk being overturned by saying at the first impression and see where the chips fall. But this, to perpetuate this craziness where we put a regulation out that's not enforceable, it's not easy to comply with, and it just causes nothing but frustration on the part of, small grassroots organizations in small towns. They have these little tax overrides and stuff, and a lot of this is volunteer stuff. And I'm sure they'd be happy to put their disclaimer in if they knew that from the first impression that's what they're supposed to do. I'd like to hear your reaction to that.
I think you raise very important concerns, and we do not think the 50 threshold is ideal. We offer it in a spirit of compromise and an understanding that there does need to be some sort of bright line test. But you're right. A person who forwards an email, a committee who forwards an email, has no idea how many it's going to be forwarded it to. You have no idea. And you have no idea how many, if you make 100 copies of a flyer, hand them out to people, especially activists, you have no ideas how many copies that they're going to go and make. They may make hundreds of copies themselves. Good activists will do that sort of thing and hand them out. So those are important issues. I think that you would want to have some clear-cut tests, so you don't have to decide on a case-by-case basis what is a general or public communication. I think that's partially what we're struggling with here, is what's the definition of that. And like I said, I don't think that you want to define it right here in this commission because it would require some thought, but you could imagine things like an email or a letter sent by somebody to somebody that they personally know. That's not necessary. That's not a general or public communication. But if it's sent by a committee staffer to somebody that they do not personally know, that sounds actually pretty general or public to me, even if they only send out 10. So I could imagine you could actually come up with clear-cut regulations. Not here, it would take some more time, I'm sure, but you could come up with some clear-cut regulations that would say, what is the definition of general or public? The 50 is a shortcut to that has some problems.
I woke up this morning thinking that we should maybe drop it down to 10. And I've been agonizing about this all morning. But when I really kind of tested against my concern about enforceability and whatnot, it really doesn't matter what the number is because of the nature of this. Unless it's 0 or 1, I should say, it's not enforceable. And it's denying the public the right to know where this thing came from and should I rely on it. So unless you have strong objections to that, I would like to have basically take all the numbers down to 1.
We would not object to that, though we would suggest in that case that the commission do follow-up regulations to define what a general public communication is in the cases of emails and direct mail and direct mail. So you could actually exclude things where you're sending an email from you to somebody that you personally know, an individual email. That's probably not it. That would be our suggestion if you were to do that.
Then we would be back to figuring out a number, most likely.
Excuse me, I had a follow-up.
Commissioner
But-
Hatch?
Within the option 2 that's on the table as to be possibly option 4, there are 2 distinct categories that, although they're not they're not obvious on their face, you've got a bunch of 200s and you got some 50s. So obviously there's some distinction there, some value judgment was made between our staff and yourself in terms of the categorization. Is that not correct?
Well, the option 1 and option 2 have the 200 threshold. As we said, we have very serious concerns about that in terms of local city and county races and so forth. So if there has to be a threshold, which is what our compromise suggestion was, then 50 is a much better threshold than 200.
Am I wrong that your proposal, though, your offer of conciliation was to make some of those 50 but not others?
Yeah, our offer was to make the 2, 3 and 4, which dealt with telephone, fax, electronic messages, and direct mailings, to give a threshold of 50 to those.
So this is on a basis of some distinction between those 2 classes. In other words,
Yes.
some of them you're not challenging the 200, but the others you are.
Well, we're challenging the 200 on all of them. We think 200 is too high of a threshold in light of 23 city ballot measures last year in 2016 being decided by fewer than 200 votes. So we would want it to be 50, but we're saying there's more of a difficulty in determining what is a general or public communication for an email, for a direct mail, because you may send these things personally to your friends. Then we don't think there's any confusion at all when it comes to campaign buttons, campaign bumper stickers, to door hangers, to
Are those the 50s?
those are the zeros.
Those are the ones that you currently are offering 50?
Those are the ones we're currently offering 0 on.
Oh, 0,
one.
okay.
Right.
What are the ones that you're offering 50?
Telephones, telephone messages like robocalls, fax messages, electronic media communications, so that'd be emails, and direct mailings.
Okay. I have no discomfort with making those all 0, let's just say, personally.
I guess I'm just confused about the concerns you have, which seem to be significant on the 200, despite the fact that it's been the law since 2001. That's where I'm having a hard time buying this real concern, emergency need to lower it when I'm not sure we've had any issue or cases brought or samples where people were fooled. But I think we should also move to other public comment, and then you can come back and follow up with any questions
Sure.
there might be, just because you yourself said there were others who wanted to talk, so.
Yes, I'll just quickly on that one, we will say that the law has significantly changed. Now disclosures with AB 249 are infinitely more clear, so it's more of an issue now. Disclosures before, a lot of people wouldn't even notice because they were so buried in fine print in many cases. But now that's not an issue, so this issue has to be addressed in our opinion. Thank you. Oh, yes.
I have a question for
Yes.
you before you.
Commissioner O'Darrow?
Thank you. So, the more I listen to this and the more I remember all the discussion about AB 249 a few months ago, I seem to recall a comment. I'm not sure if you made it, Mr. Lang, or somebody else made it, but the comment was along the lines of, we've been working at this for 7 years or however many years, and it may not be perfect, but let's get this on the books, and then we'll fix it. And that's fine. But the problem I'm having is we as a commission are now being asked to fix this. And I'm just not sure that we're the right body to do that. And this goes back to my comment that if you have a fix-it bill, right, AB 2155, fix it there. Why not? I guess that's my question. Why not fix it there?
We thought that it fixed it because the section on print materials says print advertisements shall have the following disclosure. We thought that fixed it. We changed AB 249's definition of advertisement to remove person from being considered an advertisement in communications because people had legitimate concerns about that, and so only committees can fall under those. So we thought it fixed it. We said only committees. We said print materials shall have the following, paid for by these kinds of committees shall have the following disclosures. So it seems unfortunate that it's being questioned that what the intent was, what the intent of our fix was. I think you'll hear testimony here that everybody thought the intent of AB 249's language was to require those disclosures from print material 1. Exactly. So with a couple of exceptions for candidate committees in 84305 and 84310. So we thought we fixed it. Obviously, if the commission does chooses option 1 or 2, we'll have to see what other remedies there would be to fix it. We would certainly hope that you would accept at least one of either option 3 or option 4, I think would substantially address the concerns that we have of matching the intent of AB 249.
But you just keep referring to print media and your fix. And now you're talking to us about telephone, text, and emails.
Well, it also has the section on telephonic messages, which includes robocalls. And it says telephonic messages shall have the following, and radio ads shall have the following disclosures. That's 85704.1.
And then what does it say about emails, the one concern you have, I guess I would say, conceded to?
Emails is left in, is part of the definition of electronic media communications in 85704.3. So that was also intended to be from email 1. Now, it wasn't, we didn't explicitly call out email messages in that section, so that might be something that we would address in that, but we certainly, an email message is an electronic media communication in our minds. And so, yes, that section requires disclosures on electronic media communication 1. In fact, your regulations have that for other types of electronic media communications. There's no threshold for Facebook ads or graphic ads or any of that sort of stuff in the proposed regulation. So we intended the same thing for email messages. I can see it may need some more additional clarity, but that was certainly the intent.
Do you want to let others speak?
Yes.
So other public comment?
Chairman and Commissioners, Chuck Bell, Bill McAndrews, and Hilltech. I'm not here on my own or representing any client, just representing my own opinion. Just to address initially Commissioner Hatch's question about the 200 threshold. The actual provenance of the 200 threshold was in the 70s when the mass mailing statute was adopted. The regulation 18435 included the 200 identical or similar pieces of mail threshold, and I think that it was adopted at that point for the very reason that Ms. Harrison indicated in terms of the legal standard to avoid capturing individuals or even small committees, particularly small committees that are not, despite what you may think, not aware of either the general regulations that you have in force for advertising or the very specific ones that AB 249 has added to this. Really, the 200 threshold that was picked up later in both the statute and also the initiative concerning mailings at public expense was taken, I think, also from that 200 threshold. And I guess I've been listening to this and thinking about, the issues. Obviously, AB 249 was adopted. You have to follow it to the extent that it's explicit about that. But the provenance of the term public communication in that is something that was really pulled in from federal legislation without thinking about the fact that you had something specific like a 200 threshold that you had adopted as one for mass mailing communication. So I do agree that, clarifying what public communication is in the context of all these different types of communications that are now in play is important. I would just say, and there's also the problem, I think, that this evidences, which is an endemic problem to the Political Reform Act, which attempts to regulate both local and state political activity, is that you have different consequences of the same rule that are going to apply at the local level from the consequences at the state level. Almost, I can tell you, virtually every client that we've ever represented is carefully advised about the necessity to comply with these disclaimer requirements because of the onerous consequences that can be applied and the penalties which can be enforced if you fail to comply. Usually failure to comply at the local level is based on abject ignorance of these rules and, not with any bad faith or intent, so maybe there's an out for enforcement. But I would say the problem with getting a 1 threshold, in effect no threshold, is that if you thought you had unenforceable issues at the higher level, you've got massively unenforceable issues if this commission is going to be asked to police when even a small committee, $2,000 threshold, puts out something that's arguably or not a mass mailing or an electronic communication. You've got an even greater problem for enforcement there. So I think it probably is worth a legislative fix, and I don't really have a dog in this fight. I might litigate this issue at some point, but at this point I don't have a dog in this fight, but I would suggest that it might be prudent to take the commission's recommendation, and maybe that's a signal to the legislature. I don't think they're going to need many signals because they're here. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional public comment?
Hello, my name's Bill Walzer, and I think I'm here to talk about lawn signs because I use those, and it's not 200 signs. It's the fact that I'm hoping 200 people see my sign. So I really think 1 is the number for lawn signs, and 6 square feet. I've never seen a lawn sign that big. My neighbors would object to that. Our signs are half that size, and I really think it's important that they not have lies on them, like the Committee Against Unfair Taxes, which was really 3 biggest tobacco companies, and how they defeated a proposition recently. I don't want that kind of untruthfulness on lawn signs. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional public comment?
Hi, Jack Blattner with California Common Cause. We at Common Cause were strong supporters of AB 249 as it passed through the legislature, and we've long supported the Disclose Act's goal of improving disclosure on all ballot measure and independent expenditure ads. From our perspective, as from the authors and sponsors' perspectives, that means not having loopholes for printed ads, direct mail, mass emails, or what other kind of communication just because they're produced in quantities of fewer than 200. Exempting certain communications produced by campaign committees runs contrary to AB 249's text and intent. One of the primary purposes of AB 249 was to create uniform, predictable disclosures that voters could easily identify on advertisements. Exempting certain communications from AB 249's requirement creates two reporting rules and potential for unnecessary confusion, as voters won't know whether an ad without disclosure is in violation of disclosure rules or produced in a batch of less than 200. We also fear that the enforcement of the 200 copies or fewer provision would be difficult, if not impossible. For bad actors, the 200 copies or fewer requirement would be easy to circumvent, as committees could print in-house with little possibility of auditing or use several different vendors or batches to make counting print runs difficult. For these reasons, we echo Assemblymember Mullen and the California Clean Money Campaign in respectfully requesting that the Commission reject proposed options 1 and 2 and instead adopt proposed option 4. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional public comment?
Hello, Commissioners. My name is Craig Dunkerley. I'm a longtime volunteer with the California Clean Money Campaign, but today I'm going to be reading a statement from MOVI, M-O-V-I, Money Out, Voters In. They were not able to be here today. MOVI urges the Commission to not adopt options 1 or 2 for the definition of advertisement, which would exempt certain communications under 200 pieces from the California Disclose Act's disclosure requirements. That MOVI feels that would complicate matters for some committees, including their own that they operated in 2016. It was a grassroots campaign with enough decentralization that it would not only have been nearly impossible to find a way to track who was printing what and how many, but try as we might, we'd likely have been unsuccessful in trying to do that. More troubling to us, however, is that a well-funded campaign with donors who would prefer to remain anonymous, what they might do with this 200-piece exemption. A sophisticated committee could use micro-targeting with direct mailings of 200 pieces here, 200 pieces there, 200 pieces there, each one slightly different so that they were not substantially similar. And by doing that, reach thousands or even tens of thousands of voters. MOVI is sure that the exemption was well-intentioned, but imagining the ways that it might play out during an actual campaign alarms us and does not, we think, reflect the intent of the California legislature when they passed AB 249, nor the wishes of California voters who worked very hard to achieve this major disclosure bill. MOVI, therefore, would urge the Commission to not adopt options 1 or 2, and, as we're sure you will, give very serious consideration to this matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you for your public service and thank you for listening. I'm Nancy Neff from Palo Alto, and I did work for 7 years to pass the Disclose Act. I became a regional coordinator a few years ago, and even though I'm a volunteer, it's pretty much like a full-time job for me sometimes of year. I trained a lot of volunteers and talked to a lot of groups and the general public about the Disclose Act, and I've heard a lot of questions about it. Only one I can think of relates to this issue. Ralph Wheeler said every election he writes up a flyer to give to his neighbors about what ballot measures and candidates he's voting for, and is he going to have to deal with all this disclosure stuff? I said, well, are you going to spend $1,000? He didn't think he'd get too close to $1,000. So I said, okay, you're good. It never crossed my mind that we should be looking at exemptions of 200 or anything like that. I really never heard anybody talk about that issue at all, including talking with legislators. But the regulations that we're talking about today, we're talking about campaign committees, and campaign committees should know the rules. And some of them may be looking for ways around the rules. It doesn't make any sense to me to exempt certain things from the disclosure. What if they do $1,000 or $50,000 worth of direct mail with disclosure on it, but then make 200 door hangers? Why shouldn't that disclose them? Over the past 7 years, the biggest concern I've heard from the most people is, how are you going to keep them from getting around this? And I urge the commissioners to make disclosure apply as far as possible to all ads, not just some of the ads by committees, and to please reject options 1 and 2. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Hi, Chair and Commissioners. I'm Andrew Zingali. I'm the Policy Director for California Assembly Speaker Pro Tem Kevin Mullen. I appreciate the opportunity to briefly address you on his behalf today. First, just thank you to the staff and commissioners for the considerable work on this, and I'm definitely enjoying the dialogue and the debate. Actually stepped out just to make sure after everything that's been said, I'm going to stay on message here because it's been good discussion. The comments that Assemblyman Mullen wishes you to consider were stated in a December hearing by one of my colleagues and submitted via letter, so I won't rehash that. Just to address things as they stand now, it is the Assemblyman's message that in the conversations on the bill, AB 249, a specific number of threshold was not included nor understood to be included in this regulation. So we would ask to reject the options 1 or 2. It would be in more line with what the Assemblyman and his colleagues understood the bill to be, to not have any of those threshold numbers. So please take that into consideration. And again, thank you for grappling with this. We know it's a lot of work to
And then what about option 4? What's the Assembly member's position on that with the 50?
He
Did he just get it last night at 4:05?
He wishes to be consistent with the prior comments that we've made to the commission, which was that no number was discussed or understood between he and his colleagues at the time of debating and amending and passing the legislation.
Excuse me, and follow up.
Commissioner Hatch?
Does he mean then that they were sort of leaving it up to us to decide should there be a threshold, and if so, how high? Or is
No.
his view is that there should be no allowance?
The latter, more consistent with what the understanding
So
at the
his
time
view
was.
then, to put words in his mouth, would be that, as the term was 0 or 1 on all these that are, we have 200, or and option 4 would be some of them in 50. Just to be clear, is it on all of them, the 200s and the 50, or
Right.
just
So
those categories of 50?
yeah, so they did not discuss at the time of passing the legislation. They did not discuss having a threshold on any of those. So
his view
I
is-
recognize that you're doing the real now, subsequent additional work on that, and I respect that. But to be consistent with their conversations on this bill, there was no parsing of communications of, this one will have 200 and that one will have 50. That
or anything like
I
that.
can't state that was on his behalf, that was part of the conversations in the legislature.
So his view is that we should have no allowance.
Yeah, that would be consistent with how the bill was passed in their mind, in his mind, with his colleagues.
Right. Okay.
I have a question.
Commissioner O'Darrow?
So to get to 0 or 1, right, the first one out the door has to have the language. That would take rejecting off options 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, right? I mean, you're just basically saying, don't regulate this because the law itself is clear. Are you saying no regulation is the outcome that warranted here?
I hesitate that that was not the message that I was authorized to state. It was merely that a threshold was not discussed, and therefore we would reject the options with the 1 and 2 with the threshold. Even, 50 or other numbers, those were not discussed in the legislature. So I don't want to, I appreciate where the questions are coming from, but I don't want to then evolve the statement that I'm here to make, even as I would like to, answer your question as best as possible. I'm a little
days and talking to legislators, just being a regular good citizen, I hope. And this thing is, everyone I talk with in the campaign, the activists, just they don't understand that it's just doesn't cover everything. I could go into more detail, but there's a lot more better people that can explain that to them than me. It ought to just be there. I guess I could make a side comment that because I'm doing media stuff for Santa Clara County Democratic Club, and it's a county club, and we're emerging and having impact in some small ways in elections. I could tell you the folks that I'm with, there's about 300 dues-paying members, another couple thousand on email lists that they're just too cheap to pay to be a member, but we have a whole way forward to get them to participate, right? So we might, no one would look to take advantage of a loophole with the people we're with. Hey, the Koch brothers are testing the idea of coming in and impacting city council elections. Would the Koch brothers take advantage of a loophole? Well, I don't know where that's headed, but it happened. Reported in the New York Times.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lynn Heidi Koper, and I am a resident of Menlo Park, a politically active nurse. And I remember going back 7 years ago when it was Senate Bill 52, Jerry Hill and Mark Leno in testifying. And Trent can give you the number, but that year we presented, I think it was 40,000 signatures. And my Democratic club, every time we did voter registration, had people sign the Disclose Act. There are thousands of Californians that want this. And now that I've heard about 200 as a threshold would harm smaller districts and cities, I'm going to ask you to consider 3 or 4. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sherry Fitzgerald from Vallejo, California, citizen voter. Commissioner I want to ask that you reject number 1 and 2, and if you have to, go for option 3 or 4, but a 200 threshold. I've been out gathering petition signatures with several other people for AB 249, and the intent was not to have a 200 threshold. And we spoke to thousands of people and got explained to them AB 249 and the intent of it. And after our explanations, they all signed in very easily, and we never talked about our 200 threshold. So that's all I wanted to come up here and say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional public comment? Trent, I know you wanted to respond to something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add after Assemblymember Mullins, Staffer Andrew spoke that option 3 would fit the Assembly members' conversations, that there not be any threshold. And we are quite happy to have option 3. I mean, that really is our preferred option. We offered option 4 in the spirit of compromise and the desire to have a bright line test. We think, as you heard here today, and I'm sure there's many, many more people that feel the same way that just didn't come here today, option 1 or 2 with a 200 threshold across all those types of communications would be really, really, really bad. So either one of those options, if you do choose option 3, as we discussed, would probably want a little bit of clarification what counts as general or public, or what's a private communication on email and direct mail, but that's just a suggestion. And happy to take any questions that you guys might have.
Commissioners, any questions for Mr. Langway at the podium?
No, I have a question.
Okay. Any comment? Thank you. Any comments from commissioners down at this end?
going in order?
Just thought I'd,
Because I have the coffee. First, well, generally, I think option 3 is the option that is most consistent with what I understand to be the spirit and the intent of the Disclose Act, and so I'm gonna speak toward its passage here. But first, I want to offer my thanks to the people who came here from near and far, mostly a little more far than near. It's been a long time since I felt like I felt the presence of Thomas Paine, and this is the most heartening discussion I've had in the 3 meetings that I've had the privilege of sitting up here so far. I think 1 is a bright line. I think 1 is very bright, and so in this context, I believe in the power of 1. 2002 was a hell of a long time ago. Facebook didn't even exist in 2002, much less the myriad ways that we are finding, it seems, by the hour or the minute, that it is being used and misused and abused in this country and beyond toward our collective detriment. I just want to put on the record a couple of things, because someday, particularly if the legislature does not clarify more specifically its intent that any number would suffice. With respect to staff's memorandum, I just want to state for what it's worth that my own preference and current intent to vote for option 3 is not predicated on my understanding of legislative intent through Assemblymember Mullins' communication. I am aware that there is some precedent for the proposition that that statements of legislators, even authors of subject legislation, is not necessarily to be seen as legislative intent representing the intent of the collective body. And so I understand that, and I just want to suggest for the record that for my part, it's my support of option 3 does not rest on that, although I do take notice of it, as I do the representations of what has been the intent of quite apparently many thousands of people across the state who have labored for far too long to get the Disclose Act, such as it is. I mean, many of us would rather that there be something more robust, but it is what it is, and we got what we got after your years of hard work. What I do want to suggest is it seems to me that ultimately, if this is reviewed someday, it may really come down to the nature of an understanding of the substantiality, if you will, of the relationship between option 3, if that carries the day-to-day, and what is understood to be the legitimate state interest that's at stake here. And so I want to speak to that briefly. For my part, it seems to me that there are 3 things that are driving a fair gravitation toward option 3. And before I go any further, I want to thank Ms. Lasher. I found option 4. Thank you. I appreciate it. You put it in the right place. That's why I didn't look for it. 3 things I think drive a respectful moving away from the 200 limitation, to the extent that it qualifies as a principle of law in the first instance. I mean, to the extent that County of Los Angeles versus Frisbee is still, all these decades later, still, that still controls, and I assume it is because it's in the memo. But it speaks to principles of law, right? And I don't know that 200 versus 201 or 199 rises to the level of being a principle of law. But in any event, I want to speak toward the the compelling state interest, because I think that that also has evolved over time. And the way that it has evolved is, I think, informative, I hope, on this body. First, the technology has changed since 2002 dramatically. I'm not even qualified to go through a litany of how it's changed. I mean, Facebook came on in like February of 2004. My iPhone, anyone's iPhone, did not exist in 2002. And what we can do with it, and the wonders that we can do with it, and the horrors that we can exact with technology that's come online in the last 16 years is incredible. Secondly, for my own part, it seems that the audacity with which some actors are prepared to do violence to our democratic institutions and traditions has grown. Never in my life have I seen such a disregard for rule of law as I have in these last couple of years in particular. And third is the globalization of the nature and identity and scope of those who would seek to do harm to our democracy. We now are under threat. Apologies. I'll call them later.
That was my wake up.
Wake up, dude. We're under threat from near and far. And I would rather that every communication have a requisite informative statement on it. If it had, then some of my more recent comments wouldn't be appropriate or helpful, because many of us would have seen about a year and a half ago emails that said brought to you by friends of Vladimir Putin, and we would just know that we were being duped. But it's that type of technology, it's that type of audacity, it's the globalization of anti-democratic action that I think has heightened our need to see our legitimate state interest in providing disclosure and providing information to people who want to participate in what's left of our democratic institutions. That state interest is now, it seems to me, more compelling than ever. And so option 3 seems like the best option before us today. And I think we do need to act. The legislature is apparently preparing to provide some clarification, but we saw how long it took just to get the Disclosure Act, and so let us act today with the legislation that is in front of this body right now.
Commissioner Hayward.
And now for something a little different. I still tend to be, and I thought the staff did a great job explaining why option 1 is really the option that we should be pursuing today if what we are doing is adopting our regulations to reflect the passage of the Disclose Act. The Disclose Act doesn't say anything about thresholds one way or the other. We had a long-standing regulatory standard. The Disclose Act does specifically leave to the FPPC the ability to not include under the definition of advertisement, quote, any other communication is determined by regulations of the Commission. That's sub F of 84501, whatever it is. Is it B?
A2.
Okay. I'll take your word for it. That didn't print out well. Never mind. Anyway, I fully can believe that people who worked on the Disclose Act thought that there were no thresholds because the thresholds were in the regs and no one pointed them to the regs. But it is what it is. And so I think today our task is to bring our regs up to date with what the Disclose Act did do and did say. And then if the legislature believes that thresholds were something that nobody understood to be part of the law. And, oh my gosh, why didn't the Senate committee report talk about this? Why didn't the Assembly committee report talk about this? Nowhere in those reports and those analyses that legislators were using was the notion that we would not have any threshold or that numerosity was even an issue. It's just not there. So I'm in favor of option 1 today, with the recognition that if the regulated community feels like thresholds in this day and age are super inappropriate, then let's notice that reg. Let's not do it at the 11th hour of the last reg that we really need to pass today to get the Disclose Act fully incorporated in our regs. I also, this is just an aside thing, but I'm curious when people talk about, well, somebody might make a flyer and then somebody else makes a bunch of copies of the flyer. Well, then the disclosure on the bottom for who paid for it isn't accurate anymore because it's the individual who made the copies and they're not a committee. Or maybe they are a committee if they've spent $1,000 on this and then they become an independent expenditure. Or if they're really rich, a major donor committee. Because, by the way, individuals can be committees in California. It's crazy, but it's true. I think that's all I have to say. I just don't see in the act the legislature passed specific intent to undermine an interpretive reg that it has been there for a long time. And I think you really do need more than sort of post hoc, well, that's what we thought we were doing, even though I take that to be sincere, that that is in fact what you thought you were doing. That's it.
Commissioner Odero?
Thank you. So the big question, of course, is how do we interpret silence? What I personally would rather have happen here has no place, as far as I'm concerned, in this analysis. And I say that because I'm persuaded that AB 249 is clear in its silence. And I believe, and I interpret its silence to mean that there should not be this 200 threshold. I think to regulate otherwise is inconsistent with AB 249, and that is something that exceeds our authority as a commission. So that's how I'm looking at it. I guess I'm left between 3 and 4. I really, I'm just not seeing 4. So those are my thoughts.
Commissioner Hatch, anything more from you?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Oops, excuse me. Try not to belabor this too much. As the person who asked for staff to staff up an option 3 some months ago, I certainly support that over any of the existing ones. I'm really troubled by having any thresholds at all, and that's the closest I can find to that before us without having to go back to the drawing board. And so when it's appropriate, I'd like to make a motion to adopt option 3.
All right, I just have another question for you, Karen, because I'm trying to understand the concerns with option 3 and what that leaves us open to, because there's definitely in the memo a notion of concern whether or not something is going to be deemed public or general communication.
So the overall concern with option 3 is that it may not meet the exacting scrutiny standard. What it does is it puts the commission in the position of making a case-by-case analysis of communications to determine whether or not they're of a public or general nature such that they otherwise meet the definition of advertisement. Then the result is that committees will need to try to comply where there isn't a bright line rule. And in trying to comply, they will be burdening their free speech with disclosures in a greater fashion, reaching more private type communications, less clearly public communications, with those disclosures. So if this were to result in litigation, the court would take a look at that result and find that there is less of a relationship to the state interest. And the state interest here is the state of California's interest in informing voters of attempts to publicly sway opinion. So that's why that public element is an important element, because if you're reaching more private type communications, you're not really matching that state interest of informing voters. So with that in mind, the court may determine that the section is not constitutional, not just the regulation, but the section as it's resulting in its application.
And just to follow up, when you look at the different categories we have in existing regulation, this seems to be the biggest issue with electronic communication. Is that fair to say, or am I looking at that too narrowly?
I'm sorry, could you clarify your question?
Just because we've talked about door hangers and flyers and yard signs and billboards, and a lot of people are saying, of course that's political, of course that's what the intent was, and it should be on there, whether it's one or not. And the only fuzzy area I'm hearing under existing reg, or where people are saying, yeah, there might need to be a limit, is on email communication.
Emails are a great concern, because when is an email public and when is an email private? But I would say you take that same content and you print it out on a piece of paper and you hand it to a friend, and it's very similar to an email communication. So I would say that I see the concerns in emails. I also see it in a direct mail, which could be a thank you card sent to somebody. I also see it in the printed material that is designed to be individually distributed.
But again, by committees.
Yes. But again, the committees can be individuals. If you're a major donor committee, you're an individual, and you may not be sophisticated.
Okay. Did you have a follow-up question, Commissioner O'Darrow?
Yeah, I did. So I apologize if it's in your memo. I inadvertently did not bring everything I printed, so I don't have it in front of me. But so on what basis are you saying that option 3 may not meet the exacting scrutiny standard? Are you relying on case law, or are you, what case law are you relying on?
The exacting scrutiny standard is case law from the U.S. Supreme Court, and examining that case law and the requirement that there be a substantial relationship to the state interest, I'm applying that test. There's been a number of cases that have followed the exacting scrutiny standard, and Doe v. Reed is another example. So it's an application of that case law, but I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
No, I completely understand the source of the standard.
I imagine you do.
My question was a little bit different. My question was, is there case law on point that you are relying on to say that option 3 may not meet that standard? On point. I don't mean completely unrelated. I mean on point.
I think Commissioner Hayward has a comment.
McIntyre v. Ohio Election Commission.
So what was that case?
Mrs. McIntyre was at I think it was a school board meeting where they were talking about a bond, and she had printed up flyers on her position on the bond. I don't remember if it was for or against. I think it might have been against. Ohio is really good, by the way, at generating these kinds of cases, because Ohio's been at the forefront of coming up with aggressive ways to regulate free speech and gets knocked down at the court. Anyway, so there's Mrs. McIntyre with her flyers, and somebody comes up to her from the board, I guess, and says, "You can't do that." And she says, "Yeah, I can. It's public." And then they took a flyer, and they realized it didn't have a disclaimer on it, and they filed a complaint with the Ohio Election Commission. And it went to the Supreme Court because Ohio said, yeah, you know, for those little casual flyers that you were handing out that you put it together on your own, yeah, you had to have a disclaimer on it. That was Ohio's position. And they lost.
And they lost, sorry, So I'm not following.
Ohio was enforcing a disclosure requirement against these casual flyers. It went to the Supreme Court. Mrs. McIntyre prevailed and Ohio lost.
Right. So.
Well, but, I mean, she could have been a committee.
But we don't.
Whoa,
But,
wait.
yeah.
And in Ohio, it didn't matter.
Okay, but here it does. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to get a comparison.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you're looking for a California case of somebody with casual flyers, there might be one out there. But McIntyre is the Supreme Court one that holds the level, degree of scrutiny is not, is not furthered by having people who are doing casual handout flyers have to go through the rigmarole that we put the people through.
Okay. Other than McIntyre, is there?
I'm sorry, Brian, did you?
I don't have the site on me right at the moment, but there's also another case where it was a disclosure of a committee. The disclosure required an extra verbiage. And the court found that because the law required a disclaimer that was 250 words when 125 words would have sufficed, that increase in the burden of free speech was enough that the statute requiring that long disclosure was unconstitutional. So there's just there's nothing directly on point of what we have before you today, but there's just precedent that when you start moving towards those lines that start restricting or requiring burdensome disclaimers, that they could be problematic. So all we're trying to point out is that there is a risk in adopting no thresholds.
So if you were a betting woman, would you bet your house on it?
That option 3 would pass, exacting scrutiny?
That would not meet exacting standards. Would you bet your house on your position?
I don't think it would meet exacting scrutiny.
Would you bet your house on your position?
Yes, I would. And I have a lovely home.
Okay, okay. You'd bet your house. That's fine. Okay, that's what I want to know. Thank you. Not whether you would bet. I wanted to know about the case law. Thank you.
Chair Remke?
Commissioner Hatch?
I believe I heard more than once today from proponents of AB 249 that they took an amendment in the process that would apply this only to committees, not to individuals. And I hear that someone who's got the resources could spend enough money to become a committee, but up until they spend that money, they're not a committee. And this would only apply to committees. And I think there's a third party to this that the court has never had before it, and that's a balancing of the public's right to know versus the state interest versus the private interests that want to not disclose. And maybe this is the time and place that you put that before the court. But so the only way you get there is if you adopt something that might attract that litigation.
Are you asking me if the Supreme Court has looked at committees and disclosure requirements?
This law, as distinguished from Ohio, only applies to communications by committees. That's far different than the Ohio standard, which was everybody, no matter how small.
Ohio is a different case, and the authority that I'm citing is Citizens United and Doe v. Reed, and the exacting scrutiny standard, which is actually a little different than the standard that was applied in Ohio, which was an earlier case, and a different case on its facts. So you're correct, it was different on its facts. But in this context, the exacting scrutiny is still the applicable standard of scrutiny.
So again, whenever, Chair, you're ready, I'd like to make a motion.
Well, any further questions from the commissioners before the motion? Okay, Commissioner Hatch?
I move that we adopt option 3.
Commissioner Adaro?
Yes.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
No.
Chair Remke?
No.
The motion passes.
All right, so the next item, 18, discussion of changes to the Enforcement Streamlined Program by Ms. West.
Good afternoon, Galena West, Chief of Enforcement. I'm sure everyone's still staying for my item, right? Yeah, sure. I'll give a brief introduction, and then if Commissioner Hatch, who brought this item at his request, would like to make comments as well. What I've provided today is an item to start the discussion about Streamline. So the Streamlined Memo, which we refer to ad nauseum, the May 2015 memo, is when we first consolidated all of the Streamline programs and put them in one place. And so the intent of that was to be able to look at them in a couple of years and say, you know, what's working, what's not working, what needs to be included, what shouldn't be included that the commission thinks is too egregious to be in the program. And so that's what we're starting that process now. My suggestion to the commission, as you see in my memo, is that we talk about the scope of review and give the public some idea of what the commission is looking for to change, and then have an interested persons meeting where the public can give input, which I don't think has generally happened in the Streamline program in many, many years. So I think it would be really constructive to hear what is working in the public's eye as well on the Streamline program. So what I propose the commission discussing today would be including additional violations or excluding any additional or any violations that exist now, increasing or decreasing the penalties, increasing the thresholds. An example of that would be the threshold for campaign non-reporting is $25,000, whereas in the governor's race, it's, and I had it on a Post-it. In the governor's race, it's $32,000. Here it is. The governor's race is $29,200, and for political parties, for state candidates, it's $36,500. So just making one of those contributions would already exclude you from the Streamline program as it exists now. And then increasing or decreasing the look back of 5 years from the last behavior occurred as a right to qualify or requalify for the program. So those would be my suggested areas for scope, but obviously you can talk about whatever interests you or you found as an issue or problem or something you'd like to address. I don't know if Commissioner Hatch has anything you'd like to add.
Well, first, thank you for bringing this back in a form that's, I think, reasonably understood, and also gives us an opportunity to put more cases in the stream, if you will. And on page 2 of the items that you offer up for consideration for adding to the Streamline, I think all of those are good, except perhaps the slate mailer organizations. Two bases, I think, two different reasons. One is I understand that there are very few of those cases that come before you in enforcement. And the other is that slate mailer organizations, by their nature, are folks who are paid to deceive the public about the source of the information. So I'd like to leave that off the list, if you don't mind. And some context here, these suggestions will be taken into consideration. You may come back with something different in the future. Yeah, thank you. So having stepped past that, I agree with you on the differences in terms of these categories with the party and the statewide elections. And so we should restyle this in a way that you can take those into consideration depending upon the venue that they're in. And I'm not sure, it takes some interesting writing. It might be getting too complicated, but I was thinking that there may be a way to make a reference so that these would adjust themselves, because all of these limits outside this policy are automatically adjusted.
True.
So I don't think that should in itself be a reason for us to come back and redo it.
So you're referring to the COLA adjustments that happen to the limits and
Right.
that they would eventually exceed whatever limit
Right.
we set. Mm-hmm.
And I think that when we talk about small amounts of criteria, small amounts of cash contributions received or expenditures made, small is a term that's kind of general. So I'd like you to come back with a number, whether it's 100 or 500 or whatever seems to make sense. What was in your head when you said small? And similarly, with the one bank account rule, pick a number so that it's clear, that people know what.
Do you, as a commission, prefer numbers or percentages, or do you see a value in both being presented as options?
I'm open to percentages because I know that it's difficult to apply one rule to these teeny tiny elections that were on the list that was supplied earlier. That, the whole campaign may be, $1,000, and whereas somebody else is spending $10 million on a campaign. So I think I'd encourage you to look at it and see if you think that there's a way to do that. And I think generally in each of these categories, we should have, a number or a scale. And I think that in the, as I saw in the Statement of Economic Interests, current provisions, and I thought in some of the others, there were, the term under review is used in the context that in order to qualify to be considered in the program, the filer has not have had other violations under review. And that is also a bit difficult to understand. So by the way, I commend you on the draft that you posted of an enforcement policy. And within that, I noticed it's quite granular. There's various steps that are clearly articulated. I would like you to pick one that you think is appropriate and that say that if it's not reached that level, then they can be considered.
I see. Complaint versus case, basically.
Right, and there's several other steps that I was not aware of until I started reading that this last night late. And in terms of your experience in this policy, you write that mitigating circumstances, and it says no longer in office, illness, or other extenuating circumstances. Have you developed over time with experience kind of a sense of what those kinds of things are, and do you think it would be appropriate to give them as examples of, like including but not limited to kind of things?
They're kind of one-offs. Well, I guess not one-offs because one of them is you died. But we didn't really want to put deceased, right. But some of them are one-offs, like on the run from the FBI, and we're not going to pursue the case. It's like these very odd little circumstances that the resources don't. But I could try to come up with a list.
Okay, if it doesn't seem feasible, then I understand.
Okay.
We talked about the $25,000 limit and the other limits, so we can work on that. And then the bottom of page 3, under C, campaign statement report non-filer, additional factors, D, whether the majority or a large amount of contributions were not disclosed prior to the relevant election. What would you consider to be large contributions? Is that something that we could apply some kind of a scaled? A large amount is standing by itself is kind of subjective. Each person who might want to work on this might come up with a different number.
Yes, that number is generally what would the commission freak out about if it wasn't disclosed before the election. But I'll try to come up with something a little more definite than that.
What would Hatch squeal about? And then on page 4, we had this let's see, they're both on the campaign committee provisions. It's repeated both. You have a $1,000 limit. It's got not a limit.
Where are we?
$1,000 of activity unreported.
Oh, at the top.
I forgot, what is the threshold to have to form a committee in terms of a campaign committee for a reelection, say, or?
Sure, recipient committee, the threshold is now 2,000, so that's something that
So
should be
maybe we could
updated.
update to that 2,000. It doesn't make sense to have a limit that's lower than that requires you to become a committee. And then I noticed that, excuse me, microphone. I noticed that in the two provisions relating to campaign committees, in order to be considered for Streamline, you've had not to have received a penalty from the commission in the last 5 years. However, in all of the other categories considered, including SEIs, there is no 5-year. It's a lifetime sentence that you can be excluded from being considered for a Streamline program. So I would like you to evaluate whether or not it would make sense that any of these categories be treated with the same 5-year standard, or some other number of years if it's more appropriate. I'm not picking at that. And let's see. Then you had a table on the back page, a couple back towards the back there. Let's see. Oh, wait a minute. This is on page 5, near the top, that enforcement has discretion, and under says about on the this under aggravating circumstances, and then it's towards the end of that sentence. It says the number of reports not timely filed, majority or large amount of activity not disclosed. Is there a way to make that more specific? Large amount, how much is large? Depends on if it's a small community or a governor's race.
Well, this is for state lobbying, so you'd probably be the best to give us a threshold of large.
There's no limit too high. You make a good point. I have to think more about that. I don't want to,
okay,
off the top of my head. Then on the very last page, page 6, this is the chart, and you'll notice on all 3 of those charts on the last page, it's, an amount of money plus 1%. And I think I've squawked about this in the past, that we should be making them more, the difference is not enough. So what I would propose that you consider is that where, in the first one where it's, where your compliance is the highest, it's $200 would be the same, plus it says 1%, that's fine. But if you're one of those who doesn't come into compliance until the second category, that it should be 400 plus 2%. And then likewise at the next level, the 800 plus 3%. And then the last category for 1,000 plus 4%. Okay. And that will help to adjust this according to the size of the non-compliant activity. And I do that in each of these charts, or that's my recommendation. So it would become 1, 2, 3, or 4%, depending upon where they came into compliance.
Okay.
That's kind of my 2 cents worth. Those of you who didn't fall asleep before you got to this part of the agenda, if you have any other suggestions, I appreciate it.
Any other commissioners' comments, suggestions for Galena to look into?
I do.
Commissioner Hayward. I mean, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's me. It's okay.
I'm falling asleep.
Oh, come on. Thank you. I had just, everyone should know that we had an exchange in email, and you answered several of my questions, but one came up between that and today, which is, do failure to actually, to list occupation and employer fall within the present non-reporter stuff, or are they not streamlined at all?
It is. In 2015, we added occupation, employer, and sub-vendor into the 84211, which is the non-reporting stuff.
Though they do report, they just is not a complete report, and so how do you then deal with applying the $25,000 threshold of the total contributions or expenditures? Because they've been reported, because we just don't have the information we should have.
Yeah, it's for the non-reporting, it's $25,000 that wasn't reported.
Right.
So it's, for occupation employer, it would have to go above $25,000 of, they didn't put the occupation employer properly. So the unreported amount per statement has to be that.
Okay, because when I read this, I read it and I think, but the amount was reported. It's just this other information that's missing. Maybe we could tighten that up and make that a little clearer. If there are other aspects of the reporting that have run afoul of the law, then we still count those as not being reported. That's it.
Okay. Other commissioners?
I have a question.
Commissioner O'Darrow.
So I have related, but different types of questions. I took your 2017 enforcement statistics and double-checked them. And then I took, and what I looked at was, what is the breakdown of the total enforcement cases, and how does it break down between mainline, I guess, and streamline? Both as to number of cases as well as to total dollars of penalties. And I thought, you've been in your job for, 3 years. So I looked at the 2014 statistics and did the same kind of analysis. And what I found was total enforcement cases, I think, was about the same, 350 in 2017, 333 in 2014, assuming I counted right. But I mean, generally speaking, I think I got to almost the same numbers that you did for 2017 just by looking at our agendas. But what I found was really interesting is that, and the breakdown between mainline and streamline is pretty much the same. Give or take a few percentage points. But what I found really interesting was that the average penalties for both types of cases, and therefore overall, are twice as much when we look at 2017 than they were in 2014. And I am sure there's an explanation like the penalties doubled, or somebody caused the penalties to double, or some law was passed or something. But I'm just wondering why that is.
I think the biggest reason, the law went up to $5,000, I think, back 10, 15 years ago. So it's been a while. I think it was 2002. So, but I think one of the biggest reasons is we started moving the older cases, and those were, a majority of them were defaults, because what happens is when you get priority set for you and you have to move your cases and you have to keep everything moving, if someone is non-responsive and doesn't want to participate and doesn't want to do, those are the hardest cases to move because they take the most man hours. And so sometimes those fall by the wayside and don't ever come to the commission as defaults. And so I think that we started trying to get rid of the cases from before that were sitting, and those are higher fines.
But I would understand that for mainline, because Streamlined don't go that far, right? Streamlined, we're either going to fix it right away or not. There's 4 opportunities according to your chart. So why would the average penalty in Streamlined cases in 2017, which I calculated to be $641 about, assuming I counted everything right, be twice as much as what it was the average penalty for Streamlined cases, which was $310 in 2014?
I can't answer that off the top of my head other than to
No, that's fair.
say
That's fair.
our practice currently under me is to follow the steps in Streamlined program as they are written, meaning Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. I don't know if that was always the practice to get settlement.
Fair enough. And then just a question about Streamline and historically. I have been told, and could be right, could be wrong, so let us know, but I have been told that in the past, we issued a lot more warning letters without penalties than we have recently. And I'm just wondering why that is. And you may recall that a year or so ago, a few months ago, I mentioned that I had a friend who ran in a very small campaign and was horrified by what happens to you when you make a little mistake, right? The resources used to penalize somebody when really I personally would rather have those kind of resources go to training, which we do a lot of, and I think we do a fine job. But just the kind of the philosophical approach to, number one, is it correct? Is it factually accurate that we were issuing a lot more advisory letters rather than penalizing? No, sorry, not advisory, warning letters. Sorry about that.
I gotcha.
Number one, is that true? And if it is true, and that's easy enough to figure out, right? I just haven't gone in and looked. But and if it is accurate, then what's the philosophical difference here?
Well, it's funny because I went through this with a reporter a couple years ago, so I'm kind of familiar with the numbers. What the biggest difference, and the warning letters last year were over 564, I think is what the number was. So there was quite a substantial amount of warning letters as we got back to our regular system last year. But the biggest difference was in, what's the exact time that we changed the regulation for admin term, but it was a couple years ago.
For what?
Administrative termination. So when we started getting the referrals for the $50 program, we found out that a lot of these committees were from 2009, the last time they had activity, 2005, 1999. And so writing them a warning letter did no good. There was nothing that we were going to get from this. We were going to get another annual fee referral the next year, non-filer referral, and they kind of have dropped off the grid. So what we did instead is we rewrote the administrative termination regulation and got approved by the commission in order to expand that program. So the committees that would have normally gotten warning letters were administratively terminated. And then, and of course, it has a great due process in it that any reason they would just write to the executive director and she has to reopen the committee. If they are active in any way, they just have to come up to date on their filings. So there was quite a substantial number. We had one staff member that was just doing administrative terminations and full-time because we had so many. So that took away from the warning letter program because these were the smaller committees, the ones that just hadn't filed. And so there was a time when the warning letters had gone down substantially, but the administrative terminations for those years had gone up drastically. And so now we're back to evening out.
Okay, that's helpful, and that answers the question. As we go through this review of the Streamline program, I really would like for us to also include in the discussion, where is that line for the warning letter versus fining? I don't see our mission as being the great moneymaker for the state of California. I personally don't take pride in the large, look at how much money we brought in this year. I would much rather see smaller numbers because that tells me that hopefully people are doing things right. So I would like to consider, I would like a discussion of, where are we drawing the line for the warning letters? Is that the appropriate line for the warning letters so that we find the right balance between, protecting the public from violations, but at the same time not creating a situation where somebody is too afraid to run for office because they're going to be dinged every time they make a tiny little mistake. So this is probably not the time for that discussion unless you have some great answer for that. But I do think that it has to be part of this discussion.
Certainly, and I think that that is what we started to do when we wrote the first Streamlined Memo in 2015, by putting in those paragraphs at the end that tell you, this is how you get excluded from the Streamlined program, which means if you still had a violation, you get a warning letter. But so we started the discussion, and we're happy to continue it.
Great, thank you.
Ms. West, I just want to talk about the proposed process for this, because I think you said you wanted to hear initial feedback from us, and then you would take it to IP meetings, is that right?
Yes, I was hoping to be able to schedule an interested persons meeting to get the public perspective on the Streamline program as it exists, what the commissioners have expressed that they would like to see. We would put it in the notice, and then get their comments and bring them back to the commission with possibly a draft at that time, unless there's like so many comments that we need to do sort of a pre-notice of the draft. So that's the plan. It really depends how much public participation we get on whether or not I would bring back a full presentation or not. And then this could also, the bones of it could be in a regulation if we decided to go that route. So I don't know if the commissioners have any desire to do that as well.
Well, that was going to be my point. I just feel like in the last several years, I've heard several times, now where's the Streamlined Memo? Where do I find the Streamlined Memo? And again, to the extent that this applies to 77% or more of our cases, I think it would be, it would benefit us and definitely the public and the people subject to the act that it were in a regulation. So I would, if it isn't part of this process, which I think would make sense because it would move smoother if you incorporated the changes that you heard today, you incorporate the additional comments that want to be made, and put it in a reg form that could go to an IP meeting. That's what I would propose. Again, not only do I think it's best for, again, notice, due process, I also believe there's some case law that says enforcement policies need to be pursuant to regulation. So, but at the very least, I do think it's the best way to make sure everybody understands how we're operating and has the same information.
I can look into that as well.
And then my only other comment is, I would, to the extent you can flush it out, I would like to see all those cases or proposals on page 2 added to the Streamline program. I have a little different thought than Commissioner Hatch. I think even if it's a 1 or 2 off, all the more reason to get it resolved quickly through a Streamline as opposed to a main line. But depending on the workload, I guess those could always be added later too.
Just a follow-up, do any of the commissioners agree that the fine structure needs to be looked at as perhaps proposed by Commissioner Hatch, or does anybody, because the way that I have it structured is, as Commissioner Hayward was talking about, non-disclosure versus non-filing. Non-disclosure, you start at a lower threshold amount. Non-filing, you throw out a higher threshold amount because the activity is at least partially disclosed. So I don't know if you have any comments on the fine structure.
I would just say if you do bring back the proposal by Commissioner Hatch to go 1, 2, 3, 4%, that you give us some good examples of what that would end up looking like. And I'm sure that would be helpful for the IP meeting as well, because I'm assuming the defense bar might have some issues. But maybe not. Maybe that's not that dramatic. I don't know.
For the public.
Way down there?
Yes, but is that it for the commissioners?
One other, I'm kind of excited about this because it's, to me, it's another way that we can untie resources that could be on higher priority cases that would otherwise take a lot of, or otherwise just have to be bypassed because you don't have the resources to do them. So I'm excited about expanding this programming and fine-tuning it. I share your concern, Madam Chair, about what I would call a codification issue. When it's a policy or a memo, it's sometimes gets lost track of, and if it's a regulation, certainly there's things that are required that it be not only published but maintained in a manner that's easily accessible by the public. I personally think that a lot of our written policies, the written policies that we've adopted in the past, have been lost, so we don't even know what they were. Had they been codified, like a regulation is. I'm not saying everything has to be a regulation, but I think we need to codify written policies, over time, so that we have the public and the regulated community can find these things. So that's my 2 cents worth, and thank you very much for this effort.
Okay, any public comment on item 18? Okay, do you feel you have sufficient direction, Ms. West? Any questions for us? Thank you. Okay, it is 12:35. We still have plenty of items to go through, but we're going to go ahead and take that lunch break. I would propose that we come back at 1:30, just to keep it clean, if that works for everybody. Okay, so we'll go off the record and come back at 1:30.